Good evening. Tonight, we are unpacking a massive collision between the American legal system and the highest levels of political power. We are looking at a development that effectively shatters decades of established courtroom precedent, and the fallout is landing directly at the feet of Donald Trump. To understand the magnitude of what is happening right now, we first have to look at the legal machinery that made this possible. Two separate federal judges have issued rulings that prioritize transparency regarding Jeffrey Epstein above almost everything else. One of these judges granted a motion to unseal grand jury records specifically tied to the Ghislaine Maxwell case. Now, I want to pause here because if you are not a lawyer, the phrase unsealing grand jury records might just sound like standard procedural noise. It is not. In the federal court system, grand jury materials are the vault. They are protected by something called Rule 6 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. For generations, Rule 6 has been the ironclad shield that keeps investigative secrets from the public eye. Let's break down why Rule 6 exists, because this context is vital. Unlike a public trial where evidence is presented in open court and debated by attorneys, a grand jury is a one-sided private affair. It is an investigative tool used solely to decide if there is enough evidence to bring charges. Because it is one-sided, people can be accused of terrible things without ever having the chance to defend themselves. If the grand jury decides not to indict, those records usually stay buried forever to protect the reputations of innocent people. That is the standard. That is the tradition. But these judges have looked at the Epstein case and essentially said, no, not this time. They have decided that the public interest in understanding this massive web of corruption outweighs the traditional secrecy of the grand jury. That is a seismic shift in how our courts operate. This judicial overhaul paved the way for what we are seeing right now, the release of over 3 million pages of documents. And this is where the story shifts from a legal procedure to a political nightmare for Donald Trump. The release of these files wasn't just a judicial decision, it was triggered by a specific piece of legislation. In November 2025, Donald Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act. At the time, the narrative coming from his camp was aggressive. The implication was that these files were going to expose his political opponents. He went on Truth Social that same month and posted a message suggesting that the truth about Democrats and their ties to Epstein would finally come to light. He positioned himself as the great revealer, the man pulling back the curtain on corruption. However, now that the curtain is pulled back, the spotlight is not hitting who he thought it would. Instead, it is illuminating a massive contradiction in his own history. We have to look at the timeline of Donald Trump's statements versus what these new official government documents reveal. This is not about rumors. This is about comparing the man's public statements against the official record. Go back to 2019. When the Epstein scandal reignited and became a global news story, Donald Trump was asked about his relationship with Epstein. His denial was categorical. He went on camera and stated quite clearly, "I had no idea." He claimed total ignorance regarding Epstein's predatory behavior. He distanced himself completely, suggesting he knew nothing about the crimes that were taking place. But the documents released under the law he signed tell a completely different story. We have uncovered records from the mid-2000s, official law enforcement interview notes where Donald Trump is speaking to authorities. In these documents, he isn't claiming ignorance. In fact, he is doing the exact opposite. According to these records, Donald Trump told law enforcement back in the mid-2000s that he was glad authorities were finally stopping Epstein. He then went a step further. He told them that everyone has known what Epstein was doing. Let that sink in for a moment. We are looking at two mutually exclusive realities. In the mid-2000s, Donald Trump is on the record telling police that Epstein's behavior was common knowledge, that everyone knew. Then, in 2019, he tells the American public he had no idea. You cannot have it both ways. Either he was lying to law enforcement in the 2000s, or he was lying to the American public in 2019. This isn't a matter of interpretation, it is a matter of documented fact. He was aware enough to discuss the crimes with police, yet claimed total amnesia when the political heat turned up years later. This contradiction becomes even more problematic when you look at the sheer volume of the material involved. We are talking about 3 million pages of documents. To give you a sense of scale, that is enough paper to fill a warehouse. And within those 3 million pages, Donald Trump's name appears over 1,000 times. Now, we need to be responsible with this data. The Department of Justice has flagged that within this massive dump of information, there are unverified claims. In an investigation of this size, you get witness statements that are wrong, you get hearsay, and you get sensationalism. Not every mention of a name equals a crime. That is a fact. However, there is a difference between a name popping up once or twice by coincidence and a name appearing more than 1,000 times. 1,000 mentions indicates a sustained presence. It suggests that Donald Trump was a recurring figure in the orbit of Jeffrey Epstein. It creates a picture of deep social or professional integration that contradicts the "I barely knew the guy" defense that has been used for years. The political irony here is thick enough to cut with a knife. Donald Trump initially resisted the release of these materials. For a long time, he pushed back against transparency. Then, he flipped. He signed the bill in November 2025, likely calculating that the damage to his opponents would outweigh the damage to himself. He tried to weaponize the release of these files. But that weapon has backfired. Instead of a surgical strike against Democrats, this release has become a cluster bomb that is hitting his own credibility. He is now in a position where the transparency he championed is providing the evidence that undermines his own past statements. And this brings us to the current political landscape. We are in February 2026. The midterms are looming on the horizon. Donald Trump is trying to govern, he is trying to push policy, but he is being dragged back into a scandal from 2 decades ago. On February 15th, Attorney General Pam Bondi announced the full release of these files, including a list of 300 specific names found in the documents. But even this announcement has sparked a firestorm of controversy. Why? Because of redactions. Despite the name of the law, the Transparency Act, there are still black bars on some of these pages. There is still information being held back, and this is fueling a bipartisan backlash. If the goal is total truth, why is anything hidden? When you have a situation where the government says, "We are releasing everything," but then holds back specific details, it breeds conspiracy theories. It makes people wonder if the redactions are there to protect national security, or if they are there to protect specific reputations. Are we seeing the full picture of Donald Trump's involvement, or are we seeing a curated version? This leaves us with a few very uncomfortable truths that are going to dominate the news cycle for the foreseeable future. First, the credibility gap. Donald Trump's 2019 denial is now chemically unstable. It cannot coexist with the mid-2000s police records. His political opponents are going to play those two clips, the denial and the document reading, side by side on a loop. It is a ready-made attack ad that requires zero spin because the contradiction is self-evident. Second, the strategy of selective transparency. You cannot demand the exposure of your enemies while hoping your own secrets stay buried in the same pile of documents. By signing that bill, Donald Trump opened Pandora's box, and he clearly underestimated what was inside it regarding his own history. Third, the issue of the everybody knew defense. If Donald Trump admits that his statement to police in the 2000s was true, that everyone knew what Epstein was doing, it raises a much darker question. If everyone knew, why did nobody stop it? If Donald Trump knew enough to tell police that it was common knowledge, why did the abuse continue for so long? This moves the conversation from Did he know? To why was nothing done? The Department of Justice is currently trying to manage this fallout. They are trying to separate the verified facts from the sensational noise in those 3 million pages. But the court of public opinion moves much faster than the DOJ. We are seeing a scenario where a sitting leader is being haunted by his own signature. He signed the law that released the proof that he misled the public. It is a closed loop of political damage that is rare to see in modern history. As we head toward the 2026 midterms, this story is going to be the dark cloud hanging over every campaign rally and every press briefing. The Democrats will use it to paint a picture of corruption and dishonesty. The Republicans will likely try to pivot back to the unverified nature of some claims or focus on other names in the files. But the documents themselves aren't going anywhere. They are in the public domain now. Those 3 million pages are being combed through by journalists, by opposition researchers, and by amateur sleuths. We should expect a slow drip of new revelations. The 1,000 mentions of Donald Trump are just the headline. The details inside those mentions are going to be the story for the next year. The attempt to control the narrative has failed. The attempt to frame this as purely a Democratic scandal has failed. What we are left with is the raw, unvarnished data of a criminal enterprise that entangled the world's most powerful people, and a record that shows Donald Trump was far closer to the center of it than he ever admitted. This is no longer about speculation. It is about reading the record. And right now, the record is screaming for an explanation.